We all know if it's not on the IEP, it may not get attention. Because comprehensive literacy is, at its core, an approach involving multiple areas of focus, how does that play out with assessments and IEPs? Welcome to the LOMA Podcast, episode 143.
Hello, and welcome to the LOMA Podcast. We are a community sharing inspiration and information as our teens with disabilities approach adulthood. Here is your host, Kim Albrecht, a mom trying to plan for the future of her daughter and inviting you to fumble through it with her.
This is the 13th episode of our current series focusing on literacy instruction for students with significant disabilities. We are getting close to the end. Just 2 more interviews after this one and the recap. Next week is part 2 of our conversation with Dr. Gretchen Hanser. If you missed part 1, just scroll back. It was the episode on choosing the tools for learners with physical disabilities. After that, we conclude with our last interview, and that is a chat with a self-advocate, and then the recap. The first half of this series was a steep learning curve, at least it was for me. Our guests taught us the difference between emergent and conventional literacy and how to know where our learner is in all of that. We then learned what to do with that information so as to apply it to literacy strategies like working with words, predictable chart writing, shared reading, comprehension strategies, and. Then the last few episodes have had more of a classroom and school focus. This episode falls in that camp of classroom/school focus because we're taking on everyone's favorite topic, assessments and IEPs. Yay. If we have learned nothing else in this series, I would say it is number 1, all learners are capable of literacy. And number 2, comprehensive literacy is comprehensive. There are a lot of aspects to the approach. Because of that, we need to be taking a look at if that balance is playing out in assessments and IEP goals. Joining us to do so is Stephanie Spadorcia. Stephanie Spadorcia is the chair of the Teaching and Learning Department at Lesley University, which consists of early childhood, elementary, middle school, high school, and special education programs. Her research and teaching focuses on literacy instruction for students across the disability continuum, assessment of reading and writing, and using technology to support literacy instruction. She has published articles and book chapters and presents nationally. She is a researcher with the Center for Literacy and Disability Studies at UNC at Chapel Hill, conducting research and development on literacy instruction for students with disabilities. She does work in schools in providing literacy instruction for all students and the role of assessments in a literacy program. Alrighty, let's talk assessments and IEPs. Stephanie, welcome to the LOMA Podcast.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Well, Stephanie, we were chatting before we jumped on here that you've been working in your office, and you said since March, and we had to clarify, like, oh, that's March of 2020, not 2021.
Yes.
Oh, goodness. So are you going back anytime soon?
My university will probably be back in some fashion come the fall, but we plan on still being remote through the summer, and we're actually working on adapting our modalities of classes in response to what we've learned from the pandemic, that busy professionals coming to, I work in Cambridge, Massachusetts, so coming to Cambridge is very challenging, traffic and parking wise for busy professionals. So we're looking to pivot a little bit to allow more flexibility and increase the technology in our buildings, which is very exciting.
Yeah, I feel like there's going to be some positive changes that do come out of COVID. Telehealth is one that I'm I hope that sticks. I hope we can keep doing that. So interesting that, it'll be neat to see how education changes as well.
Right.
So, well,
Yes.
Stephanie, we are glad to have you from your home office there
Yes.
in Massachusetts to talk about assessments and goals and IEPs. This whole series, we've been talking about literacy and comprehensive approaches and even how to get the teams on board. But unless it's on an IEP or part of a goal, it may not get done. So it seems like an important conversation to have.
Yes, very much.
I feel like at some point, my daughter's in high school. I feel like at some point, even literacy goals, reading goals, they just fell off of our IEP at one point.
Yes.
Is that the norm, or what are you seeing out there?
So I think, unfortunately, definitely with age, we see literacy as an instructional area of focus fall off, like you said, once students get older. We even for kids who are neurotypical, right? We assume that by the time you reach 4th grade, 5th grade, you've learned how to read. We have nothing more to teach you. Now you just use reading and writing to show knowledge in all the other content areas. But we know for even typically developing students without disabilities that kids still need to learn how to strategically learn harder words, how to spell, how to write in the different genres. So writing and reading instruction should be part of every kid's program, regardless of their age. When there's a deficit in literacy, when reading or writing are hard for a student, even more reason that it should be really specific in the IEP so we can make sure to see if we can close a gap, accommodate, of course, if there are significant differences for them to participate in the general curriculum. So reading and writing are part of every student's life. I've yet to meet a student who's truly not a reader or a writer. Even if they're 18 years old and they don't read near where they should be, they're still a reader or a writer, and we still need to address it and work on it.
Well, and that reminds me of the conversation that we had with Dr. Gretchen Hanser.
Yes.
And in that conversation, listeners, you can flip back to that one a couple of weeks ago. We had a conversation about students with significant physical disabilities, whether it be vision or control of the extremities, how everyone is a reader and a writer.
Yes.
Everyone. So hearing you say that, it's echoing that conversation that we had a couple of weeks ago.
That's why I like Gretchen so much.
We all
and
do.
her work.
Yes. Yeah. We've referred to her a good bit throughout this series. Even before she came on, her name was popping up. So yeah, it is interesting how those goals do tend to fall off. I don't know if it's that we're giving up or that we feel other things now are more. Well, here's what I feel like I see. I feel like I see the shift move towards more independent living skills and things like, which are all important. But when I think of literacy, when I think of reading, when I think of writing, I feel like that is one of the most important things for life skills. Like, to me, that is safety. That is community. That is, self-determination. It's like all the things. And it's like, if we want to spend time on anything, if we want to be like pushing the gas pedal towards the ends of these like transition school years, I feel like this is where it should be.
It's the ultimate human right. It's a basic right to be able to read and write and interact with the environment, the society, the community that you live in. That's why literacy instruction should never go out of a student's academic programming. And one reason why it often goes, unfortunately, away is most teachers, at least here in New England, where I teach, many teachers are not equipped with the coursework to let them teach reading and writing once we get beyond the elementary years. So it's not that teachers don't think it's important. They weren't taught that it's important or given the skills. That's why I'm in teacher education, and we have significant coursework in language and literacy development, even if you're going to teach students who are at the high school or the transitional ages up to 21. You still have to know how to teach reading and writing.
Yes. And again, you're echoing what we've been hearing is we've been focusing on literacy for learners with disabilities, but what we have been discovering is teaching literacy is teaching literacy. Like you have to know the basics of how to teach literacy, and then you modify for your students.
Correct.
You make the adjustments as needed. So
Correct.
when we think of like knowing this, like setting that as something we are all going to agree upon out of the gates. So listeners, hopefully you're on board with us that this is something that is important and that should not be dropping off of IEPs. Where do we go from there? Because, I think assessments, I think benchmarks, I think tell us where to begin and where to go, and maybe where there may be some mistakes happening along the way.
So too often, I think I'm actually going to answer the second part of your question first. Too often the mistake is we assume the assessment, the test, is going to give us the answers. I remember going into my graduate work in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, thinking if I only knew all the assessments that were out there, all these norm referenced assessments, and I'll have all the power and I'll know exactly what to do. And what I didn't know is how to teach reading and writing enough. And so I had to go back and understand how to teach reading and writing. What does reading and writing instruction look like? What should be the stages of development for that? Then I can use assessments that I have available to me, or new ones, or ones that are still to be created, to interpret the results in light of that perspective. I have to understand, let's take reading, for instance, what is involved in development of independent readers. I want every student to read independently, silently, with comprehension. When you pick a good book out for the summer, and the summer will come at some point here in New England, and you have a good book that you want to read, or a magazine you want to read sitting at the beach this summer, you're reading it yourself. No one's asking you to reread it or check for 3 text-to-self connections or reread it 5 times to build fluency. Those are instructional things we do because ultimately we want every kid to read silently with comprehension so that they can pick and choose to read things that are engaging, motivating. So if we have that as the big hole that we're looking for, silent reading comprehension, then we can use assessments that are available to us to ask assessment questions about how to get there. But if I just I always joke with my graduate students, I teach courses in assessment and diagnostics. If I pick the Spadorcia test of fabulousness, because every other person I know uses that test and they make all these differences with kids, that's great to learn that test. But if I don't have an interpretation perspective, a theoretical framework to interpret the results against, it's not going to give me what I need. I have to know what I'm looking for in order to assess and then ask the questions to interpret the answers.
Okay, this may seem like a silly question, definitely probably for you and probably for all of the educators and SLPs who are listening because they are familiar with assessments. But so I'm asking as a parent here, when my child is given an assessment such as that, what kind of information are you gleaning from that? So you're saying like the assessment gives you whatever data, but then you have to interpret that data into the framework of, okay, how does then that help us move them towards independent reading with comprehension? So what kind of stuff is being extracted from that assessment that can maybe go 2 ways with it? How it can fall flat and how it can be utilized.
Okay. So a great example is almost every reading assessment or norm referenced assessment that's used to determine eligibility for services for special education has a nonsense word test on it. So it's a phonetics test that assesses decoding by putting in nonsense words. And students that don't do well on that, what that lets us know is they have a hard time with phonetics. What we often see happen as a mistake is kids then get nonsense word reading as part of it's a goal and their IEP, and then we teach them how to read nonsense words. What's missing where it falls flat is the reason we assess phonetics through nonsense words to ask the question, does the student have enough phonetic skills to be able to decode words efficiently to support silent reading comprehension? So we have to go back to the whole, which is silent reading comprehension. I have to give credit to my mentor in the field, James Cunningham, for this model. I don't own it, but he's taught me everything that I need to know about reading. So reading comprehension involves word identification. I have to know the words on the page. I I have to be able to understand the language of the words, and I have to be able to visually process the print. He calls it print processing.
Mm-hmm.
So if I test a student with a nonsense word test, it just tells me, do they know phonetics in English to be able to put together efficiently to decode words? The goal isn't get better at reading nonsense words. The goal is I want to know, do you have enough words, phonetics to be able to decode words so I can teach you better, because I want phonics instruction to make your decoding so effective you can't help but do it, right? We shouldn't have to listen and laboriously hear kids slowly read each word. That lets us know too much of their working memory is going towards decoding skills. So therefore, we need to teach them to do it more efficiently. So that common test, a nonsense word fluency test, which there's many tests that have that, what I see as a mistake is, they don't have nonsense words. We need to teach them nonsense words. And they don't remember the reason we assess it is to ask, how is that contributing to the whole or the silent reading comprehension?
Now, this makes me think of, and I don't know if it was the result of an assessment. I'm not familiar enough with what the thought process was when my daughter began reading instruction. But I do see this now that she has a strong ability to, her phonics is strong. Her decoding is strong, but she does not understand a lick of what she is reading. So when you look at it like with the end goal in mind, comprehension, it's like, even 2-3 sentences there, it's not even an understanding if a word, you know how like one of the things that you'll read a sentence and it'll be like, well, what word makes sense in there if you're trying to decode or whatever. And she can't even like realize that a word she's reading does not make a lick of sense in that sentence. And it was heavy phonics and sight word based instruction when she was young.
Right. And so that's why I teach graduate school, so I can't do anything without a PowerPoint. So it's funny to be talking without a PowerPoint visual in front of me.
We're going to picture you. We're picturing you. Okay, listeners, we're all sitting in our desks with the wood top, and you're in front of us with the PowerPoint. Okay, here we are. We're ready.
Thank you. So imagine a table with 3 legs. The top of the table is silent reading comprehension. This is the metaphor I use with my students. The top of the table is silent reading comprehension. One leg is identify words identification, and that's both sight words and phonetics. And that's what most students who are in special education services, we focus on, because majority of students that have a language-based learning disability, which is the highest incidence disability, right, in schools, and it comes from lots of different reasons why, they need help with sight words and phonics. So we have a ton of programs and assessments out there to guide that. The other leg that's equally important, that actually is the first thing to develop, is language comprehension. That is the ability, right now, you're using your language comprehension skills to listen to me and you talk. Right? You're listening to me and you're understanding it. Well, it also involves your ability to listen to text and understand it. So that's why an assessment question should always be, what is the student's listening comprehension level? And we don't do that enough in schools. I always include it in my battery and teach my diagnosticians that I work with that we should do a listening comprehension measure. Now, some assessments that come from the speech and language field have, in the clinical evaluations of language fundamentals test, the SELF, they have listening to directions, listening to paragraphs. Those will give us information so we can compare how are they with reading words, but also how are they with listening to language. Because when you do a listening comprehension measure, I'm taking away the text demands, just asking you to listen so I can say, okay, when there's no print demands, how do you do? Because listening comprehension, your ability to listen and understand language as it comes in, is a strong correlate to overall reading comprehension. So it sounds like your daughter got a lot of what we see in special ed, which is lots of words, different word programs, right? The word program of the week, the word program of the year. And we keep assessing, it's working, they're making progress, but we don't look enough at language comprehension.
Right. Well, and I think too, as a parent, we talked about this in one episode. I can't remember. Maybe it was Sally. I think it was Sally Clinden's episode.
Sally Clinden, yeah.
Yeah. And she was saying how, we were talking about how a lot of times, with good intentions, we tend to overly support the learners, and we like that what they're creating and doing looks very much like their peers.
Yes.
And I feel like that is easy to do with word recognition and what, like as a parent, I remember thinking like, oh my gosh, look, she's reading.
Yes.
Like I could put a book, for example, like a biscuit book with, the golden lab little puppy
Yes.
dog. And she could read every single word. And I'm like, oh my gosh, she's reading. But she didn't understand it.
It's also very easy to teach words and to assess words and see progress. So for an IT team, we want to have measurable goals that we can reach to show we're doing something. And special education is geared toward word identification as the problem. It has been the norm for years. We're very much still following a stage model. So Gene Shaw at Harvard gave us the stage model of reading acquisition. And the first stages are about learning letters and sounds and words. So we still spend a lot of time focusing on that. That model assumes comprehension will develop. The reason I talk about two things at once, word ID, again, imagine that table with two legs. The leg of the table with word ID has to be strengthened, and so does the language comprehension leg at the table. That's why we do teacher read alouds, and teachers and parents read at home with their children, and speech language pathologists, right, talk and engage and try and develop expressive and, most importantly, receptive language, because receptive language is the skill you're using when you use listening comprehension. And so we don't spend enough time as special educators focused on language comprehension. What often happens, I see also, is students have a true difficulty area in sight word acquisition or phonetics, or phonemic awareness and phonics skills at the younger ages. We seize the moment, we teach to it, we do that really well. And then this language comprehension thing emerges. So it can be that you have a pervasive reading problem over many years of your school career, but at different times, different things are the problem.
So, Stephanie, did you say there were 2 legs or 3 legs to the table?
There's 3 legs.
Oh, what's the third one?
The third one is what Jim Cunningham calls print processing. It's about looking at the print, the connected print. So we all know students who can read words in isolation, like on flashcards, right? Or down a list of words. But the minute they have to read it in connected print all together, it falls apart for them, because there's all these other cognitive skills we have to use when we're processing print or reading the words on the page, like eye movements and projecting your appropriate prosody or your voice and intonation, knowing, how each word connects to the next word for monitoring of things. And print processing is correlated the most with fluency. We see fluency in schools. We assess for fluency like crazy. Like you said, many of those big box programs assess, and what they assess for the most is oral reading fluency, because oral reading fluency has the strongest overall correlation to silent reading comprehension. If I read well out loud, chances are I read with comprehension, but it doesn't always match. Doesn't always mean that I am reading with comprehension, even if I sound like a good reader.
Right. Well, I find that even with myself, that sometimes, like if I'm reading out loud, I'm not always comprehending what I'm reading. I find that actually I comprehend better if I'm reading silently than if I'm reading out loud, which, is that weird?
No, that's not. That's what's supposed to happen.
Oh, okay,
so
good.
That's why we have this thing called print processing, and that's what it helps us understand. So young children or developing readers, regardless of their age, until they have enough word identification skills under their belt, until that leg of the table is strong, they have to read out loud to understand it, right? But it actually because of print processing that we develop that inner voice, is what it's called. That while we're reading silently, we're actually sub-vocalizing and we're recoding print into speech neurologically in our brain. Okay? So that's why you or I read something silently to understand it, and then we can read it out loud. Vice versa for young developing readers. They have to read something out loud first before they can silently read it. That magic turn usually happens in middle school. When kids get to a middle school level, so beyond 5th grade reading level, we start to have that magic happen. Until you or I, as a proficient adult reader or a proficient reader of any age, let's say you come home and you have a a legal letter waiting for you in the mail and it's full of legal jargon, then we have to probably read it out loud
Oh,
because
you're
it's hard for
right.
us. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, you're right.
So you're not unique, you're normal.
You just got in my head. Look how you just got in my head, in and out of my head and all around it. Oh,
Yeah.
interesting. So am I hearing this correctly that when we look at reading goals, we had said that we want to make sure that those goals do not drop off of IEPs, especially with these older learners. Like the push should be literacy. So those three areas, those three legs of the table, word recognition, language comprehension, print processing, should we be seeing those three areas in an IEP like annual goal? Or what do we do with this information?
So I think first the goal has to be the student will read silently with comprehension at least one level higher than they are right now. We can't expect more than 1 year's growth in 1 year's time for any student, right? We would like to see it happen. But so if I'm reading silently with comprehension at the first grade level right now, even if I'm 15 years old, you want me reading silently with comprehension at the second grade level by this time next year. Then underneath that, we can have objectives in the areas that are our areas of need that the assessment results tell us.
Wait, hold on. Pump the brakes here. So when you said, I was moving down this street all wrong. When you're saying silently with comprehension as an end goal, are you saying it's more, because you just said something like silently with comprehension at a first grade level, silently with comprehension at a second grade. Are you saying like little mini stops along, like silently with comprehension at every single level?
So it might be independently because they may not be able to do it silently right now, but that is my goal, is they'll be able to read independently, hopefully silently with comprehension better than they are right now.
So do we move on to, so let's say that our kiddos are reading at a first grade level. Do we move on to like more complicated literacy strategies if they're not doing that? Or is it like a parallel track, or is it like a gas station? Like, okay, you're silent with comprehension, fill her up. Okay, back on the road. The next one is second grade level, silent with comprehension.
And we want to keep moving it up, especially if you have a 15-year-old who's reading at the first grade level. We're not going to stop just because they could do silently at the first grade level. I want them to be able to read silently with comprehension at higher and higher and higher levels.
Right.
Maybe they're not going to be, and by the way, at the end of fifth grade, reading levels are irrelevant.
Well, for all of our kids, for everybody listening right now, reading levels are kind of irrelevant for our kiddos, right?
But there's a strong science about reading levels up to about fifth grade. After fifth grade, reading levels are relative to the background knowledge that you have. But that's another topic for another day.
I mean, we're talking, most of our listeners right now, we have teenagers who are still emergent learners. That's like where we are.
Right. So I want to get each one of them to have some independent reading skills and be on that highway, if we're going to use that analogy, to silent reading comprehension. Right now, they might have to read out loud, but they're still independently reading with comprehension. I eventually want to get to the place that they can silently read with comprehension. The other reason why the silent is really important is because so often we assume kids who are nonverbal can't do this because we can't hear them read out loud. And that's an exclusionary practice that is really it really goes against everything that the research tells us. So we know nonverbal individuals can read silently with comprehension. We just can't hear them read out loud or ask them a comprehension question in the same way we would to a kid who uses oral speech for communication.
So if we then want to turn this into, and it sounds like we should because it's one of those legs of the table, turn this into or it's the top of the table, turn this into a goal to support that, what would the goal look like that can be assessed? Because at the end of the day, on the IEP, at the end of they have to do the paperwork of, how do they turn something like that into a measurable goal on an IEP? Or how do they even assess it?
Right. So for every student, we should have assessments in our repertoire on our shelves that allow us to assess silent reading comprehension. That can be through, formal assessments, reading a paragraph, answering multiple choice questions, which is not very dynamic, but that's a very valid and reliable way to do it. We can engage kids in conversation. Novel idea, talk with them about what they're reading. Oh, and even more reason for kids who are students who are non-speakers to have access to AAC or communication systems. So they can say what they're reading, how they're talking about it, how they're thinking about it. That's the best way to do it. So we should have both authentic assessment that matches the instruction, like teachers walking around the room and doing having individual conversations with kids about their reading and what they like and what do you think is going to happen next to the character, or what's 3 things you just learned about frogs. And we should also have more structured assessments. We'll say they can both be formal or informal to be able to measure these little steps along the way. So I personally like to use an informal reading inventory to monitor progress. I think that becomes really important, and we can adapt an informal reading inventory for students with a variety of disabilities. So I could do it with my, as it's written in the book with a student who uses speech to communicate, but I can also adapt those tools for a student who uses AAC or other nonverbal cues to be able to communicate, so I can assess as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is also interesting too, because first of all, I thank you for clarifying a misunderstanding I had all along. I had heard that reading with comprehension, silently reading with comprehension and I kept hearing it as the end goal. The end, like that's what happens when you have everything else. You're going to be able to do it. I wasn't seeing it as like that is the fuel in the tank kind of thing.
Yes.
Yeah. So thank you for clarifying that. I think my daughter for so long, and even when I started kind of trying to take over her reading here at home, it was that leg of word recognition. Very, very heavy on that leg. A little bit of the language comprehension, but hardly any. I mean, not much print processing stuff at all.
So that's why it's really important. So we have to say what's the student's needs. So our assessment question should be, at what level can the student be independent with text right now? Right? At what level is that? What are their word identification skills? What is their listening comprehension skill set? And what is their ability to process print? We have to know the answers to those 3 questions so we can look at the whole together. And then it's sort of like who's on first, who's doing what in the day. So not everybody's working on phonics, but the teacher that has the most expertise and the materials available to teach phonics is working on that. Maybe the speech language pathologist is working on the language comprehension piece. Maybe the student is in an inclusive setting during guided reading block or the reader's writer's workshop time of the day, and therefore we're supporting the student by making sure they have text at their reading level so they can process print. So it's not everybody having to do everything. It's how do we as the team do that? An activity I often do when I consult with teams is we make 2 columns. On the left are what we know about the student in terms of their literacy needs. What are their areas of need or areas that are hard for them? And what are their areas of strength? And then on the right, we say who and what level of materials are they working with? So it's especially when students are older, we say, oh my goodness, they're getting 30 minutes of instruction and they're only getting phonics, or they're in, 9th grade level science and social studies and history, which is wonderful, but they're not accessing materials at their level, which right now might be the 1st or 2nd grade or even lower level. So no wonder they're not getting better at reading. We've actually made it that they're not accessing materials at their reading level all day long. Sometimes I call those IEPs where they accommodate them out of reading. We actually, reading so hard for them, we make sure they never have to do it. The only way to get better at reading is for us to direct instruction at you for it.
I love that that example you gave too of splitting everything up and then putting your strongest players in their strongest positions within those areas. It reminded me too of we've been referring a lot to the book Comprehensive Literacy for All by Karen Erickson and David Copenhaver, referring to that a lot in this series. And there is, I should know the exact page number, but there is a chart in that book that is reminding me a little bit of of what you're saying here, where it kind of lays out the different areas of instruction, kind of how you're using the visual of the table.
Yes, yeah. And
Mhm.
kids should have time. We should direct instruction for words, word study time, directed comprehension time, independent reading time, and of course, writing time.
So then what I hear you saying is looking at all those blocks, putting your strongest, putting your SLP in the area that makes the most sense for an SLP, putting the paraprofessional in an area that they really enjoy doing and feel comfortable with. And interesting. But then you have to, going back to this idea of assessments and goals, that you had said like area of need and area of strength. So taking each of those little boxes, each of those areas, and looking at them, and then what? Making sure that your IEP goals hit each one.
Right. We have time in the day in the service delivery grid to make sure we're covering all those areas, that we're still making progress. Like you said, it's not an end goal that they can read independently. It's they wanted to do it better. So it may be, that they need most of their time dedicated towards phonetics, as an example. I keep using that as an example. But maybe the student that's the area they struggle with the most. So they have the most independent, one-on-one or small group time dedicated to that. But they're pretty good with comprehension if somebody reads it to them or with them, so they can be included in the general classroom that part of the day with some teacher or paraprofessional help. And so not every answer is going to be direct instruction, but we need to make sure we have direct instruction in the areas that are pushing that table down. What is the most significant area that's holding them back at this moment? We need to make sure we have all eyes on that area, but that the whole is always accounted for, because otherwise they're not going to get better at reading and writing.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about what should be done. Are there any things that should, I don't want to say not be done because that just sounds so harsh and final, but are there things that are maybe being overly assessed or maybe done in such a way that really is not very helpful? Like, are there any, we've talked a lot about good ideas. Mm-hmm. Are you seeing anything out there that it's like, maybe not?
So 2 things that come to mind. I already gave the example of the nonsense word test, right? So what often happens is nonsense word test shows that they don't do well in that task, so we just teach them how to decode nonsense words. And we don't do enough of reading real words for the real purpose of reading texts, magazine articles, whatever's of interest to the student. The other thing I often see, and this is definitely because of it's been the last 15 years or so, we do a lot of oral reading fluency measures. So a 1-minute fluency check. The reader reads a passage for a minute if they can, and we see how many words they can read accurately in 1 minute. And if they don't do well, don't meet the benchmark on whatever that test is at a certain time of the year, the answer is give them more fluency time. What we don't recognize is fluency is sort of like your blood pressure. So if I go to the doctor, what's the first thing they do? They check my temperature and they check my blood pressure. If my blood pressure is up or my blood pressure is low, they don't know why it's up or why it's low. They just know it is. So if I don't have good oral reading fluency as a reader, it doesn't tell me why I don't. It just lets me know that one measure is not working. So then we have to do more diagnostic work to figure out, why is their oral reading fluency low? It could be they need more practice with fluency. That is a legitimate reason, but it's not always the reason. It could be their oral reading fluency is low because they don't have enough sight words. It could be because they don't have enough phonetics. It could be because we're reading text and not doing enough introduction of the topic. Or it could be, like you said before, Kim, it might be that they're a good reader and they actually have to read it silently first and then read it out loud orally, which is funny to me. When good readers are asked to read things orally and don't do as well, right? We often they need more oral reading fluency. No, they've actually surpass that. They actually need more strategic comprehension instruction. Now, I know you said many of the audience members who are listening probably have students whose level are more emergent or transitional. So oral reading fluency, you'd be happy to have an oral reading fluency measure. And especially if you have students who are nonverbal or inconsistently verbal, oral reading fluency measures don't apply to them, right? We don't have, and those are the most common benchmark that we have in schools right now is oral reading fluency measures, because they're very reliable and they're easy to give. And if I give it, you give it, John down the street gives it, we're all going to get the same score. But it doesn't mean it's the best measurement that's out there.
Yeah, I doubt that probably 90% of our listeners that it's relevant to 90% of the people listening.
But there are correlations to oral reading fluency for non-speaking individuals. So we can do something called a maze assessment, where I take a passage, keep the first sentence in place, and many assessments have this, but we don't always use them, and then delete every fifth or seventh word. It's called a maze assessment or a closed passage. That is correlated with oral reading fluency. So I can use a correlation activity to assess fluency in a non-speaking individual. Do you see what I'm doing there?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So that reminds me too, when we talk about like a lot of our learners, our learners that we are working with, people listening to this show, use different types of, Gretchen calls them alternative pencils.
Yes.
And so one thing, and I think this goes a little bit into assessments, we talked about the SET framework. So listeners, go back and listen to, I can't remember who talked about it. I'll link it. But we talked about the SET framework and the importance of like knowing your goal before you pick the tool.
Yes.
So I think that's probably very relevant to this conversation. But the other thing too that I'm thinking of in all this, I mean, we're talking reading literacy. But I'm thinking of all that goes into reading for learners with complex needs. I mean, a lot of it is like occupational therapy kind of, visual. Mm-hmm. So when I think of assessments, I'm thinking of like the importance of the entire team.
Yes.
Seeing this, and that the assessment may not just be a reading assessment, but it is, how's the visual field?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah. Yep, that plays into that third leg of the table there, the print processing, your ability to make eye movements and your visual perceptual skills. So you do have to know those things. Some students need to read with like a, black background with white letters, or or the yellow, the contrast becomes important. So those things are important, but we're still going to teach them how to read. Mm-hmm. We might change the font, like use sans serif font versus, a curly Q Times New Roman kind of font. We might do those kind of things to help readers, but we're still going to get them to still give them opportunity and access to text.
Yeah. So yeah, that's where occupational therapy comes in. It's just, it's interesting. I posted this on my Instagram stories just yesterday, how we're trying to, my daughter uses books and magazines as a STEM, as a sensory STEM, and getting her to see it as literature, as, something to read has been a real challenge. And I had a autistic woman respond to it and, talk about how the urge is so strong. And she was, giving some tips on how to help her use it. So a lot of times, I think we think it's literacy or we think it's reading, but it's really more regulation and vision. And so just making sure that kind of stuff is looked at as well.
Right. And another thing I think teams do as a whole is we keep looking for the perfect assessment tool that's going to tell us exactly how to teach, and we've wasted time not teaching.
Yes.
Right? So if you have a 15-year-old, a 12-year-old, a 7-year-old, it doesn't matter the age, and they're not reading at the level or writing at the level that you want them to, don't wait till you find the perfect assessment. Start teaching. Just start teaching, and then you'll be able to get glimpses of their literacy development that maybe you can use some of the tools that you have. But there is no, especially when kids are more complex, there is no magic assessment tool that's going to go, oh, now we know how to teach them. Just start teaching them.
I see that a lot where teachers are like, we just want to teach. Just let us teach.
Right. Teach. Yeah.
Yeah. So good stuff. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I know that you also have, as I was cyber stalking you, preparing for this interview, I saw that you have a website, a consulting. So I would love it if you would just shamelessly plug that. Any additional resources? Tell our listeners where they can find you and what we should do next.
Okay. Well, right now I'm safe in my home office during the pandemic, but normally you can find me at Lesley University, LEY University in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I direct programs in special education, early childhood, elementary, middle school, high school, as well as teach in the reading specialist program. But I also do private consultation and work with teams and individuals through my name, Stephanie Spadorsha Consulting.
Awesome. And that, listeners, we will link that in the show notes. So easy peasy, just click right on it and it'll take you right to Dr. Spadorsha. Well, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Stephanie. Listeners, 3 more to go, and they're good ones. You heard us mention Dr. Gretchen Hanser in this conversation. She is with us next week. So do tap subscribe on your podcast app so that episode is waiting for you when you wake up Tuesday morning. Thanks for journeying with me. You make it way more fun.